going to talk a little bit about the LID site design process, and really this is part of this class. We're talking about planning your project. We know enough about LID projects now. We know a bit more about the design process, and that's usually one of the big failures on projects as you go forward and you find out all the steps you need to go through to get everybody endorsed on the project, understand all the requirements, and oftentimes early projects had to go through a lot of design iterations. One important thing to remember though is that this is just a guidance for what a design project needs to be. I think when we presented this last time, it caused a lot of concern, like, oh my gosh, the scopes of these projects are getting a lot higher. It really needs to be scaled to your project, but it's considerations of important steps to consider and scale appropriately for your project. So as a general outline of the design process, and this is again just for this purposes of this class, you can mix and match it as necessary, but these are all really key important steps. First one is develop that project baseline and charter for the project. Get everybody's endorsement. What is this project? What are our goals? And what are we trying to accomplish? Develop a basis of design. Again, understand what those requirements are and understand how you're going to progress with the design and get that information done first. You're going to need a team and engage a number of stakeholders on these projects because you are touching a lot of different design disciplines and a lot of a different look and feel about how these projects are built. Do your homework, do site inventory and analysis. Actually, then you're going to be really doing your site assessment and developing that site plan. What is that project going to be? But you need to know a lot about the project and the community and the interests that are going to be related to this project early in the project. So getting to that first step, this is developing the project baseline, or what we call the charter. What is the project? What is the project scope? Develop that early on in the project so you can understand how far you're going to go with this project. What are the requirements you're going to do? What is the project schedule? And again, this is really important not only from the planning perspective of doing the design, but also for construction, because weather requirements are important for knowing when you're going to assess high groundwater tables, as well as when you construct the project. You're not going to generally want to do low impact development projects during January. Granted, today's a beautiful day, but most of the time we're going to have rain, which is not a good time to be going out and exposing soils for infiltration. Also, another key aspect is understanding when you're going to establish the plants. If you're not going to try to develop an irrigation system, you need to plant those plants during the wetter seasons. That way they don't dry out and die. Understand your construction budget. We all want to do a great design, but understand what the limitations of those budgets are and how you can use LID to actually make that construction budget fit within there. Design is done correctly, it can be competitive with a conventional design. Understanding the jurisdiction and code requirements. So understand, what is that baseline? Go through the code, understand it. And one of the key aspects here about the code is everybody's required now to start going through their codes and reducing those and eliminating barriers to low impact development. Oftentimes we have those roadway widths that are required to be provided. That doesn't leave much space for LID. You need to understand what those requirements are and those setbacks are so you understand the limitations for doing low impact development designs. Another thing you can look at is sustainability goals. A lot of projects are looking for that extra carrot. What's going to be their lead standard that they're going to try to achieve with this project? There's also newer sustainability goals that are being developed in every day, it seems like. There's green roads for roadway projects. There's lead site design. There's also Envision for public infrastructure projects. So define which rating system you may try to apply and how does stormwater fit into that rating system early in the project so you can make sure you get those points. And I think one of those very key aspects, especially on public projects, is maintenance capabilities. How are these projects going to be maintained? Who's going to maintain them? And what kind of equipment and processes do they have for maintenance of these projects? So you can try to consider that within a design process. The next step is developing the basis of design. What are you going to design to? Get that down on paper early on in the project so you can understand and everybody knows exactly the assumptions you're going to apply on these projects, and so you don't have to come back later and reiterate to achieve a new design requirement that you didn't know about early on. Some includes the project background. What are the specifications and drawing format you're going to do? You're going to do that on any project, not just an LID project. What are the sustainability requirements? So what are those points we're going to try to reach? Are we going beyond code on some of these projects to achieve a sustainability credit? What are some of the restrictions and easements related to the project? And what are the permits that are going to be necessary for this project? And where are you measuring the point of compliance for the projects? From the site civil perspective, there's a lot of other information there. What are the frontage and right-of-way requirements for this development and for this jurisdiction? So are you going to need to do frontage improvements? What are the setbacks there? What are the requirements for civil grading? And very key aspect is the utility criteria. What utilities are necessary for this project? What utilities are going to be constructed if it's a new development project? What existing utilities are there under existing conditions that you need to keep setbacks from? So those are horizontal setbacks, vertical setbacks, and understanding where and when you can have say a bioretention near an underground power line. Or do you need to move them? What is the process for moving those utilities, and who's responsible for moving those in terms of the franchise agreements? And there's a lot of information about landscape design criteria that have to be integrated onto a low-impact development project. What existing tree preservation requirements are there, and what requirements do you need to do to preserve those trees? How far away do you need to stay away from those critical root zones? That's really the important piece, so those trees can grow. And then what other buffers do you need for landscaping? You can't just vegetate right up to, you can't build right up to the edges. Where are those landscape buffers that are necessary for a site design? And can you take advantage of those for your stormwater requirements? Quite a bit more to put into a basis of design, but there's a lot of criteria that you definitely want to get on paper and have it reviewed by your design team and endorsed by your design team prior to beginning with the project. Because again, if there's misunderstandings along the way, they may require quite a bit of redesign later on in the project. The next piece is the team and stakeholders. First and foremost, we need the owner and developer to be on board early on the project, engage them on understanding what low impact development is, what the value to the project is, and what that's going to mean for a difference in terms of how to deliver those projects. You need to understand and integrate with all the public agency reviewers, and there's a lot of different departments that go into a low impact, that influence a low impact development design. Certainly the stormwater management reviewers, transportation, utility departments, and the land use planners and zoning. And in some jurisdictions, there may be other interests that may be interested. An architect, if you're doing that kind of project, surveyors, any conventional project, geotechnical engineers, and I'm going to add on to that hydrogeologists. It's not just the geotechnical considerations in terms of foundation support and wall design and all of that, but it's where the water's at and where water may go if you infiltrate. It's a very key consideration of the project, and engage them early in the project so you understand their scope for developing that design criteria for how you're going to model the performance of these practices, but also understanding the risks. And they can map out where and when LID or infiltration specifically is appropriate. Again, we talked about critical areas, so you may need a wetland or a biologist to evaluate and identify those critical areas. Arborist, if you're going to try to preserve existing trees, an arborist is a very valuable tool or player in the project. And outreach. I mean, I do a lot of retrofit projects, and then when you're doing a retrofit of a neighborhood, you have to engage the public. You have to have them understand their critical criteria so the project can be a success. And again, police and fire department, Curtis talked a lot about them. So there's a number of interests that would play a role in a low impact development design. It doesn't mean that you're engaging everybody and having this gigantic team that wrestles this project all the way through, but understand what kind of input you may already have through code that address those interests, and plan the project appropriately to have those touch points so that you can make sure that there's no rework of the projects. And again, I think one of the key ones here is maintenance staff. I love early on in a project to engage the maintenance staff and understand what they need for the project. This is your site inventory and analysis. What are we going to need to learn about the site to determine where we can do low impact development, where can we infiltrate, and where should we not infiltrate? So there's a lot of stuff you can do just based on doing your homework without actually going out and digging test pits and doing explorations. You can look at soil surveys and analysis. You can look at historic records of stream channels and wetlands, especially if you have a green site. Aerial photos, especially like Google Earth and some of those that have those historical aerial photos, you can see how the property has changed over time and see what it was before it was developed previously. A lot of times there's existing maps and topographic information. Definitely identify if there's any groundwater protection areas or wellheads that need to be protected, because that's a very key restriction for infiltration. We don't want to be polluting the sources. And just descriptions of local site geology. There's actually a great tool, GeoMap Northwest, that was put together by the University of Washington, that has a lot of records in the Puget Sound area about prior geologic explorations. And so you can take advantage of that prior investigative data to figure out what your exploration plan will be on the project. And if there's already existing data that tells you a little bit about the feasibility. And then definitely get out on the site and take a look at it. Characterize hydrologic and geologic conditions out there. What is existing native vegetation? Are there signs of erosion and drainage patterns? Is there exposed soils? If there are infiltratable soils, if there's actually standing water, then you certainly know that there's some restriction areas. You know, how do you integrate low impact development and site development so you can minimize impacts to that existing native vegetation? So the next step is to develop the stormwater site plan. This is actually required in NPDES permit. It's requirement number 1 to prepare the plan. You know, this plan requires you to use site-appropriate development principles to retain the native vegetation and minimize. The best thing you can do from a low-impact development design, especially if you have a new green development site, is to minimize how much you impact. Because once you impact it, you have to mitigate it. So if there are areas that can be high-functioning that you can leave alone, then great, you won't have to do anything further. And they can also utilize that as a benefit for the site design. Review the local codes. Like I said, they're being changed to incorporate certain LID principles. Purpose of this document is to prepare it for local government review. So they understand what homework you've done and understand what that intent of that design is, what is the performance that you're anticipating, and what are limitations. This is where you're going to document whether or not low impact development is feasible or not. So in the stormwater site plan, it actually lays out, the minimum requirement 1 lays out 8 steps. And this is what's been in the prior manuals. And actually what's shown here in yellow are the steps in that manual that really required rework to allow or require low impact development on sites. So we need to analyze the conditions, do your site layout, do an off-site analysis, determine what the minimum requirements are for the projects, prepare your permanent stormwater control plan, not your temporary, but just what are your BMPs that you're going to put in place for permanent mitigation of stormwater. Prepare the construction stormwater pollution prevention plan, which is how are you going to manage stormwater during construction. And actually, I would almost highlight that one in yellow too, but we already had really strict restrictions there that required you to implement those standards, but they're very important for doing a low impact development design, is identifying how your BMP is going to be constructed and how you're going to protect them during construction. Completing the plan and then checking for compliance. And really, if you want a lot more detail than we have in this class, the LID guidance manual really covers 1 and 2 very well, in a lot more detail than what the stormwater management manuals do. We're going to get into a little more detail about what the manual requires you to do for existing site conditions. What I talked about previously was a lot about just what you should do for projects. This is what you're required to look at. So you need to prepare a survey for the project site. You need to develop a soils report. That soils report needs to be prepared by a professional, geotechnical or geologist. If you're only doing a small site that requires MR 1 through 5, then an on-site sewage designer is okay for that assessment. You also need to document in that soils report the surveys, test pits, and borings, what exploration data did you do. And really what's key there is KSAT, which is the saturated conductivity of the soils. What is that infiltration rate you're designing to? From either tests, direct tests, or grain size analysis, and there's more details in the manual about how you come across those estimates. What is the depth to the restrictive layer? And what's critical here is what is the restrictive layer during the winter? What is that minimum depth to the restrictive layer? If you're doing a larger project that requires triggers 1 through 9 and the minimum requirements, you also need to do an assessment of lateral flow. If you infiltrate, where could that water go? Is there any hazards that could pop into, like basements or slopes? And then do a vegetative survey of any protected areas. So a little bit more guidance on where you need to do your explorations. If you're doing a small commercial site, then you're required to do 1 small-scale pit test or pilot infiltration test. If you have a large commercial site, then you need to do more than 1 pit test. You need to do it 1 for every 5,000 square feet. If you've got a residential site, then there's guidelines in there for how to lay them out if you have a roadway network that you're building. The guideline starts with a 200 feet for every length, basically essentially of roadway. But you also do need to monitor the groundwater through the wet season to evaluate whether you have adequate clearance to that groundwater layer. There's guidance in the manuals for the correction factors, everywhere from like cutting your tested infiltration rate to 1/3 to no correction factors. And then there's guidance in there for WWHM and legal documentation. Now, if you're only triggering minimum requirements 1 through 5, then it's a little bit simpler to do the soils analysis. Really what you're doing is just documenting low impact development or infiltration feasibility for permeable pavements. Really what you're trying to determine is are you above or below the 0.3 inches per hour threshold, and you have more than at least 1 foot of clearance to below the bottom of your facilities to groundwater or to a restrictive layer. So you're not quite getting to that design level. It's just, is it feasible to infiltrate there, and then can you do those practices? Okay, and a little bit more detail in there, the assignment and infiltration correction factors, soil suitability confirmation. But really what it is, it's getting a little bit more into the details of what you need to submit for the projects, requirements, and demonstrating your low impact development feasibility. So next we're going to dive into the permanent stormwater control plan. Again, this is really the meat of it. This is what we're going to actually build for these projects. So for small sites, what you're going to require to provide in the stormwater site plan are drawings in location for all on-site stormwater BMPs and the drainage areas to those BMPs. Provide your details, figures and maintenance instructions for those projects. Really what you're doing is you're justifying the infeasibility decisions, or if you're not going to implement practices, you have to justify that you're doing it because it's infeasible to do low impact development or infeasible to infiltrate. And you need to document your justification for that process in this report. Or you also may choose that you want to go for the LID performance standard, which is in a different course, but then you demonstrate compliance with that LID performance standard if you're not going to choose the prescriptive BMPs for these small sites. For larger sites, then you're going to need a lot more detail because, again, there's a lot more risk and there's a lot more potential impact from these sites. So you need to provide a summary of the project, executive summary of what is the project, what are you designing, list out your performance standards, treatment, and lists, describe all the LID features you're doing on the project, show how you're meeting the flow control requirements. This is minimum requirement number 7, so again, how are you meeting that? Show how you're meeting water quality standards, minimum requirement number 6, and describe the conveyance system. So a little bit more on there, just an outline provided in the manual for what is in there. You have the summary, description of your public or private ownership, so describe what's in there. Areas that you're protecting on the site need to be demonstrated. You need to show drawings of all your on-site stormwater facilities. Identify where you're retaining planted trees and how you're doing credit calculations based upon that. Again, you're also going to do your infeasibility documentation in this report, and then provide all your design details, figures, and then maintenance instructions for how to maintain these facilities that you're going to build. There's a little more detail on that. So completing the plan, again, this is what you're going to need to do is also not just what you're going to build, but how you're going to maintain it in the long term. You need to provide operations and maintenance manuals for all stormwater treatment and flow control facilities. This includes bioretention, permeable pavement, and vegetated roofs. And in the manuals, there actually are some draft operation and maintenance guidelines that they provide for you. So it's really taking a look at that, putting those into the plan so they're documented along with the plan of the project. And then if you are doing anything special in the project or have any special maintenance requirements, you supplement those base templates. Not everybody has to develop these from scratch. You can use them from the manual and put them in there, and it provides really good maintenance guidelines. At the outset of a project, you do want to talk to the maintenance staff and find out if they have anything different they need for these projects. Are there different maintenance routines? And if there are, then tailor this O&M plan to meet what their needs are, so they're not pulling out something that just does not fit how you're going to do maintenance for these projects. If you're going to require maintenance to be done by the property owners or homeowners associations, then you need to provide declaration of covenant and grant of easements to make sure that everybody has access to it and understands what their requirements are for these projects. Again, it needs to be done for all stormwater and flow control facilities, and if you're doing it on the property owners, then it needs to be signed and recorded for each lot for the projects. So a little bit more on that. So if you're doing track lots and demonstrating those obligations, then you need to include all your plat and short plat approvals. You need to put information in the deeds and restrictions, such as the covenants and easements for doing these project practices, drawings, detailed designs, and maintenance provisions so that whoever's taking over these properties has all that information to them. And then oftentimes a low-impact development design that's been platted will have assumptions for impervious areas and may have restrictions for those individual lots, and those need to be recorded with those deeds and covenants as well, so that those individual lots are not building above what the assumed stormwater protection plan actually had in the plan.